Yeah, you've got to start with questions. It's the only way you can really get a good understanding of what your purpose and values are. And a lot of the questions that people use don't work so well. So the two questions that I ask people to use or get people to use, first one is for values is when don't people work out around here? Because values are very much how you behave, how you act. And so if you see when people aren't working out, you get a sense of the stuff they're rubbing up against. So it's a great way to hack into your values without going down the expected route and ending up in the top 10 list, which is where people end up if they ask, what are our values? And then from a purpose standpoint, the big one is what's most important to you, right? So even though why is what you're trying to understand, it's a really bad question to get you there because it always feels like an accusation when someone asks you why. Why did you do that? But so if you ask what's most important to you, then you can dive into that. You'll start with a big list of stuff because there's always more than one thing that's important, but then you've just got to keep asking and keep working. And then the last step is really understand, once you land on your answers, understand what you mean by the words that you use. Because people tend to wordsmith stuff and it's got to sound right? It's got to have the sexy line or whatever. But they don't really think about what does that term actually mean. And without that, it's really hard to make it real for people because they have so many, we all have different definitions of things. And so those are the really key things. Delve into the questions, keep asking them until you know, and then figure out what you mean by the words that you use. Too many organisations don't actually use purpose and values once they've found them, right? They become slogans on the wall, a page on the website, but they're not actively incorporated into the day-to-day work that they do. So that's really how you keep them off the sidelines, is bring them into everyday stuff, right? Into that vast, unheroic work that everybody does every day. And have people ask, how's this helping us meet our purpose? Is this keeping our values? Really actively think about those things across all the actions and decisions of the organisation, and you'll absolutely avoid sticking them on the sidelines. Risk and brand is something that a lot of organisations don't think about, right? Because they think about brand as this creation thing. So if you think about brand instead as a result of promises that you keep, the biggest risk, of course, is making promises and not keeping them. And that's so if you think about when organisations have let you down and you feel badly about them, that's what's happened. And as a result of that, of course, the brand takes a hit. You know, brands are always either eroding or continuing accomplishments or achievements. And so the way you make sure you're always continuing that achievement is make promises that you can keep and then keep them. Yeah, well, so a promise is a future state, right? So we don't make a present day promise, right? It's always something we intend to do in the future. Experience is current. It's what's happening to you now. Right? So the relationship between the two is that the experience either keeps or breaks the promise. So they're actually incredibly entwined. You can't really separate them. And too many people try to. So when I see a lot of experience work being done, both for customers and employees, they're talking about all this stuff that they're going to do, but they don't actually think about what are the promises we're making with all of that, and can we do it? And so the relationship is, it's really tightly held, and you've got to think about both. So this depends a little bit on where you sit on the spectrum of the type of company you are, the type of business you are, right? So lots of businesses will claim, we put our customers at the centre of everything we do. And yet some incredibly successful organisations did no such thing, right? So it depends how you think about it, right? I think it was Henry Ford who famously said, if I asked customers what they wanted, they would say a faster horse. when he invented the car. And so customers aren't great at actually thinking more than one or two little increments beyond what their current experience is. So while you've got to be mindful of what they want and mindful of what they need, which actually are two different things, really trying to ask them what those things need to be is not a great strategy necessarily. Can give you some clues, but lots of really good ideas have been ruined and watered down by market research. So I'm not a fan of really spending too much time. I'm not saying ignore the customer because they're there to buy what you want. But you've certainly got to keep it in balance with, why are you here? What do you care about? What's most important to you? If you just follow the road that they take you down, they might take you over a cliff. I think the biggest difference is that understanding that a promise is something that you have to think about before you make it. You can't make a promise and then think, oh, how are we going to keep that? It's not a good strategy. So the ones that really do keep their promises, they understand that they've got to think about all of the different factors that go into a promise before they make one. And they connect it, again, they strongly connect it back to what's our identity, what's our purpose, our values, what's most important to us. How do we do things around here? And are we saying we're going to do something that we're setting ourselves up for failure? The pachyderm in the corner. It's interesting, marketing's the elephant in nearly every room I walk into because people strongly correlate it with brand. And it's really the story that marketers have told. They jumped on it pretty early and claimed it as their own. And it really emerged, I think, from in the early days when a lot of the corporate identity companies, the companies that the logo and the naming and things, started to think and call themselves brand companies. And so that started that correlation, and then that then just migrated over into marketing, which was sort of still strongly related to that. And that's where the conversation stayed ever since. There's very few people out there questioning that narrative and trying to push it into a different realm and have people think about it differently. That's sort of why I'm sort of have the definition that I have of it, that brand is the result of the promises you keep, not just the stuff you do in marketing, but everything the organisation does, like top to bottom, side to side. But I think it's easy for people to think about it that way, right? It allows you to sort of treat it a bit like an event and put it in a corner. Say, oh, we're done with that now. We can go on and focus on the other stuff. But the other stuff is actually the stuff that achieves the brand. Stop doing bad stuff. It's the simple answer, but it's so true. I'll talk to organisations often and they'll say to me, our customers think about us this way, and that's not who we are. And I ask them the question, so what did you do? Like, what was that thing that you did that created whatever that made them think that? So perception doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? Someone somewhere did something, said something, heard something that resulted in that perception. So what was your relationship to that? So if you want to change how they perceive you, change what you do. Organisations go through a maturing process for sure when they start out, and when they first start up, everything's a bit messy and they're not quite sure where they're going. And so it's hard to have this strong, grounded identity in the early days. That doesn't mean that you can't have a sense of what you care about. And that's the time where you really test it out to get a sense of, is this actually most important to us? It might shift a little bit once it bashes up against the everyday reality of doing business. As organisations mature, they get more clarity. They get a bit more centred, a bit more grounded in that sense of identity. And so their sense of the result can be likewise, a bit stronger, a bit more robust. So it's somewhat of an emergent process, I think, much as an organisation's growth is emergent. It sort of goes along the same trajectory. I was thinking about about this question because it's such an interesting one. The obvious answer that everyone would jump to is, oh, the CEO. Right? The way I look at it is every person in the organisation has a responsibility and a relationship to the promises. So if you're in a decision-making role, then you get to decide what are the promises we're going to make. So you have an obligation to figure out, are there promises we can keep? If you're in a more of a frontline role and you're tasked with being the person who has to keep the promises, then what do? Well, if it's a promise you aren't resourced to keep, if they haven't thought about can we keep it and made it anyway, then I think in that situation your responsibility is to question and to say, well, hang on a minute. We're not going to be able to do this. We're actually making a promise we can't keep. That's really hard because a lot of organisations don't allow their employees that sort of a voice. But I think if you really want to be an organisation that keeps its promises top to bottom, side to side, you've got to have that kind of environment.